Megan, welcome to the Astroben podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me, Ben. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very good. It's Friday evening here, so I'm in weekends mode, but you're just gearing up for a Friday, being on the West Coast. Um, let's jump straight in there, if that's okay. Tell me about SpaceFund and its mission. For those of the listeners that may not have heard, I'd just like to get a sort of top line. What is SpaceFund? What do they do?
So, yeah, we are a venture capital fund investing exclusively in the space industry. So, I like to say we don't do aerospace. We don't do drones or electric airplanes. We just do the space part of aerospace. So, above the Kármán line, let's say, 62 miles or 100 kilometers up. And we have a portfolio of 19 companies that we've invested in across the space sector. And we will continue to help fund those entrepreneurs with vision and excitement for the industry.
Vision, excitement, and capital. The most important things for a startup.
Yep.
um, how did you? How
Well,
did
and
you?
that's exactly it. We founded Space Fund because there was so little smart
Mm,
capital going into the industry. There were a lot of people pouring money into launch because, well, Elon, right? He's exciting, and you think, oh, if Elon's got a launch company, then I need a launch company. And so we founded the fund specifically to fill that gap for those entrepreneurs who couldn't find VCs who understood the industry.
mm. And how did you start the company? Because this isn't your first entrepreneurial endeavor. So how did your can you give me a brief kind of overview of your career to date and how you co-founded Space Fund?
So I started my space career working at the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston in their technology transfer office. So obviously NASA invents a lot of really cool stuff, but they can't make any money off of it because they're a government agency. And so they transfer that technology into the private sector. And that's how I first started learning about the entrepreneurial space sector. This was many, many years ago. And from there, I worked in several different space companies, and probably most interesting of which was my time as chief operating officer at Deep Space Industries, which was an asteroid mining company. We were way ahead of our time, a little too early. You know, one of the hardest parts about being an entrepreneur is timing the market. And so we were a little early as an asteroid mining firm. I also had a marketing and PR firm focused called Brand Delta V, focused on helping space entrepreneurs get the word out and communicate with the rest of the world. And then my co-founder at Space Fund, Rick Tomlinson, and I had worked together for many years, nonprofit and for-profit entities, and I had been telling him for a long time, like, I really think there's a need for a space-focused venture capital firm. And he agreed with me, but the business case didn't quite close. So a venture capital fund has a 10-year investment horizon. And the issue was, can we find companies that will go from seed stage startup entrepreneurs to exit, whether that's an IPO or a merger or acquisition, within that 10-year time frame? And when we founded the fund back in 2018, that was still a big question. There weren't a lot of examples of that. And so we did a lot of research. We kind of tested the market, did a bunch of primary research, and we found that, in fact, and at that time in 2018, there were 50 space startup companies that had gone from seed stage to exit in less than 10 years. The average age at exit was 7 years. And so once we had that data point, we were like, okay, now we're sure that we've got something here and we can go ahead and start the fund.
That's fantastic. How does Space Fund select which companies and projects to invest in? Obviously, now we're living in a very vibrant market where there's you probably see thousands of pitch decks every year. But what's your current process? How do you decide which companies to meet with in the first instance and then to ultimately invest in? What do you look for?
Great question. So we have kind of two stages of diligence. The first is that, do we want to even take a meeting with this company? And there's three hurdles that have to be crossed to get that first meeting. I call this tech, team, and timing. As I mentioned, timing the market is really important, right? Is there going to be a product market fit? So that's the timing part. The team. Is this the right team to take this technology all the way through to make it a viable business? And then technology. Does the technology work? So one of our advisors and a good friend of mine works at DARPA. He's a commercialization manager at DARPA. And he always says, if it purports to break one law of physics, fine. If it purports to break two laws of physics, now we've got a problem, right? So does the technology actually work? Is there evidence that the tech is viable? So tech, team, and timing gets you through that kind of first hurdle to get the meeting. And then after that, our due diligence process does get pretty intense. We look at all the financials, all the tech, and really kind of do a deep dive into the company before that then goes on to our investment committee, who makes the final decision about whether or not to write a check.
Tech, team, and timing. Sounds easy, doesn't it? I mean, there's such an eclectic mix of companies that you invest in. Many people listening will have heard of companies like SpaceX, Orbit Fab, Axiom, Voyager. Tell me about some of the other companies that myself and some of the listeners may not have heard of, because there's a few there. You say there were 17. Tell me about some of the other ones.
19, actually.
Oh, sorry.
So no worries. Well, and I've got to give this one little caveat here. Like any good mother, I love all of my children the same. I don't have any favorites, but I will pick a couple that I think may be exciting to your listeners, that things they haven't heard of before. So one company in our portfolio is called Rhea Space Activity. They're commercializing a NASA technology that allows spacecraft to navigate outside of the GPS network. So the GPS network that we all know and love, that makes our Google Maps work, that GPS network lives in low Earth orbit. So what happens if your spacecraft is going beyond low Earth orbit? You're going to medium Earth orbit or geosynchronous orbit or the moon. How do you navigate without Google Maps, right? And so they've got a novel NASA technology that they're commercializing to help these spacecraft navigate as we move further and further out into the universe. So that seems like not super sexy, but really important and really valuable technology, right? So another company that I like to highlight, seems a little out of place in our portfolio maybe, is a company called Eden Grow Systems. They're also commercializing NASA technology that was used on the International Space Station to grow vegetables so that the astronauts can have fresh food. And they're now commercializing that technology here on Earth so that individuals and families can grow their own food in their homes, which in a post-COVID world where we now understand how sensitive our supply chains are, having that food security in your home, I think, is really valuable to a lot of people. And then the idea is, as humans move further and further out into the solar system, having this technology to be able to grow all of your own food and take it with you wherever you go in the solar system is also really valuable.
That's super cool. How different is it with the space industry? Because most venture capital firms, as you say, they have a sort of 10-year expected return, various stages where they exit. But the space industry, obviously, it's a new economy. Everything takes a lot longer, and you have to think in terms of decades. So out of all the companies that you've invested in, I mean, first of all, like quite a few of them could end up being a 100x return by the looks of things, because there's so few players. But how does that affect how you run your business? Does it change anything in the model? Do you just have to be more patient, or are there other things to consider?
So that is the issue, right? We're a venture capital fund. Our investors, because we're fundraising and we have investors just like any startup would, are expecting their returns in 10 years or less. And so we always have to keep that in mind when we're making investments. One of the reasons we're not invested in a Mars colony, let's say, is because that's going to take more than 10 years. So we have to look at those companies that are enabling the long-term future, but are going to get to a profitable exit in less than 10 years. So that does very much restrict the type of companies that we can invest in. a lot of people in the industry like to talk about what we call the tyranny of the rocket equation, which, the more you need to lift, the more fuel you need, which makes you heavier, which means you need more fuel, which then makes you heavier, right? So that's the tyranny of the rocket equation. The tyranny of the VC equation is that we're looking for these companies that can create completely new markets, but they have to do it in 7 to 10 years. And so that does really limit the type of companies that we can invest in. There's a lot of statistics out there that say less than 1%, so by some metrics, 0.04%, right? Like significantly less than 1% of startup companies receive venture capital funding because so few of them can meet those metrics that we need to make a VC fund work. So there's a lot of profitable, exciting companies out there that maybe they're going to get to profit in 10 years or 12 years or 15 years. Maybe their profit is going to be 10x their starting value, not 100x. So those are still good businesses. They're just not the right fit for a venture capital fund.
Sure. I have to mention this as a Brit, obviously. You're on the board of SpaceForge, which is a British aerospace manufacturing company, headquartered in Wales, Cardiff, Wales.
Yep.
Wales. Do my best Welsh accent. What are they up to? I know they were involved with Virgin Orbit, and like us Brits, pretty stoical. Haven't been put off by that. By what happened, but what's a SpaceForge doing, and how do space funds support SpaceForge?
So they're a really interesting company. They're doing in-space manufacturing. And this is something that a lot of people have talked about for a long time, manufacturing fiber optic cables or 3D printing human organs, using the kind of natural environment of space, low gravity, all of that. But SpaceForge has a really unique take on this, a really unique concept. Again, during, we invested in them actually before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, it became so obvious where these supply chain issues were, especially around computer chips and manufacturing of the parts that you need for computer chips. Well, it's very difficult when you're going down to the atomic level that you need to get the purity and the ability to actually perform with these computer chips. You need to have a vacuum in order to manufacture these silicon wafers for the chips. You need to have a vacuum. You need to have near 0 degrees Kelvin. And that's very hard to create that environment on Earth, but that's the natural environment of space. And so SpaceForge is going to be sending these manufacturing plants into space to utilize that environment to create something that's so needed and in such high demand here on Earth, which is the parts for these computer chips. And we also have another company that's based in the UK called SEN, the Space Entertainment Network, that are doing live video of the Earth from space. So imagine being able to watch in real time video of events happening here on Earth that are coming from these satellites in space. So that's the other UK company that we have that's based in London.
That's awesome. You've obviously been in the industry a long time, and the last 10 years especially has been so dynamic and has accelerated all sorts of startups. How do you keep on top of current trends and challenges in the space industry? Do you have a kind of team that go to different networking events and listen to different podcasts and a sort of keep their finger on the pulse in terms of what's out there, or do you wait for people to come to you, or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, we got to do both, right? You got to have a push strategy and a pull strategy, right? So I go to lots and lots of events, lots of conferences. I typically am a speaker at kind of all of the big conferences here in the States and abroad. And that's a really good opportunity to meet new companies and talk to them about what they're doing. We also do a lot of outreach, whether it's through our blogs or social media, that kind of pulls those companies in. And we also have our own database of all the space startups that we've encountered. And so right now that database has over 3,000 space startups in it from around the world. And this comes from the New Space Business Plan competition that I co-founded in 2009. This comes from the research that we do. For instance, we have our reality rating databases where we go through each one of our investment sectors of interest, catalog every company that exists that's in that sector, and then we publish that data publicly on our website. And so we're constantly trying to see what's going on in the market, to be investigating, talking to all of those different startup companies. And like I said, not all of them are a fit for the VC model, but we like to know what they're doing and what markets they're serving, and who their customers are, and kind of catalog that as much as we can. It used to be a time many, many years ago where I knew most of the space startups, most of the entrepreneurs. I knew them personally. And then it got to a point where it's like it started to just mushroom, right? And I had to start an Excel spreadsheet to keep track of them. So we do our best to keep our finger on the pulse in a lot of different ways.
Of course. And tell me more about the New Space Business Plan competition, because those of my listeners that do listen to the podcast a lot know that I have aspirations to start my own space tech company one day. And I'm sure a lot of people listening do. You know, now it's not a crazy idea to want to start a company in the industry. What is the New Space Business Plan competition? And can you give any hints on how to make sure that your entry is as good as it can be?
Great opportunity there, I think, for a lot of people. So I co-founded with a gentleman named Thomas Olson in 2009 the New Space Business Plan competition, the purpose of which was to give space founders a platform to speak to investors while also teaching them how to speak the language of investment. So rocket scientists and engineers maybe aren't necessarily great at speaking the language of finance. It is a different language. It's like learning a whole new language. And so the business plan competition also has a boot camp aspect to it, where we really help the entrepreneurs learn how to speak to investors, and then we put them out on stage in front of a room full of investors, right? And so that's done through a nonprofit called the Center for Space, Commerce, and Finance. You can find that on the web at cscf.space, Charlie Sam, Charlie Frank.space. And we do several of them a year, usually in conjunction with other conferences. So you're going to be at the space conference anyway. You might as well throw your hat in the ring to present at the business plan competition. And it's a wonderful project that I think is really helpful for earlier stage entrepreneurs to get their foot in the door, start to learn how to speak to investors, and get that kind of first exposure to the investment market.
That sounds like a great opportunity. Another really clever outreach activity that you do is you host a podcast as well called the Mission Eve podcast, where you interview inspirational women in the industry. I've chatted to a few of them myself. I sort of went through the list and saw some familiar names. Are you doing the podcast again?
Yes, we just started post-COVID. And so it's, I think, really valuable. Right now, the space industry is less than 25% women. And one of my long-term goals, something that I hope to help enable before I retire, is the permanent human settlement of space. So if we're going to have permanent human settlements out in space, we're going to need 51% women for biological reasons, if nothing else, right? So how do we get from that 25% to that 50%? And one of the things that there's been a lot of research done by people much smarter than myself have showed that girls and women need to actually physically see themselves, somebody who looks like them, doing a job, doing a thing, to encourage them. A lot of women are visual learners. They want to see somebody doing a thing to believe that they can do the thing. And so I interview women across the space industry doing all kinds of different jobs, whether they're lawyers or teachers or engineers or marketing specialists, so that hopefully this can inspire more women to join us.
Yeah, that's an excellent endeavor. And doing that alongside the Artemis missions to send the first women to the moon, it's great timing. What did you learn from? What have you learned from doing the podcast today? Is there something that's sort of a key takeaway from the people that you've spoken to, other than the kind of mission to, you know, make the future better for women in the industry? Is there anything that you've learned as a sort of trend from speaking to these amazing people?
I think probably one of the biggest takeaways for me is that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to be in this industry, right? I've interviewed women who started their careers as yoga instructors or elementary school teachers and found their way into the space industry, found their own niche. And so I know that when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. And when I realized I wasn't going to be an astronaut, I kind of gave up on my space hopes and dreams for several years until I found my way back to it through my business endeavors. And so for me, that's the biggest thing, is you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You don't have to be an astronaut. Space needs everyone. And there's room for you here. Whatever skill set you have that's valuable in the oil and gas industry or the, as a lawyer or whatever, space needs you. We need all of those skill sets.
Yeah, that's excellent. I completely agree with that. I was just I was looking in your website just to change the conversation a little bit, and your tagline is sort of caught my attention. The world's first trillionaire is going to make their fortune in space. What's your thoughts around that? Are you just looking at people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and seeing these billionaires, sort of corner the market with opening up access to space, or are you thinking a new company is going to be developed that we can't even comprehend that is going to make the world's first trillionaire? I was just kind of intrigued where that sort of statement came from.
So actually, it's a quote. I believe it's from the New York Post. I can't remember. Don't quote me on that. But it is a quote from somebody else. We didn't say that, right?
Okay.
We just used that because we thought is so apropos, right? And there's kind of a joke also in the industry that Elon and Jeff made their billions to spend them in space. They're not making their billions from space. They made their billions and now they're spending it in space, right? But I think probably the best way to contextualize this is as far as investment sectors go. The space industry is the only investment sector with unlimited upside potential. There is an unlimited amount of real estate. There is an unlimited amount of energy. There is an unlimited amount of resources when we look at space as an investment sector. There's no other investment sector on Earth that can say that it truly has unlimited upside potential. And so there's lots of different metrics and studies out there that say that the space industry is going to be $1 trillion industry by 2040. And whether you believe the big banks or not that release all these statistics, it really is this unlimited potential that we're after from an investment perspective.
It's so interesting, and it's kind of. Do you worry about the sort of the equity of opportunity for people to get access to that market? Because if it just becomes wealthy nations and private companies, do you think it's going to leave other parts of the world behind? Is SpaceFund sort of trying to invest in different companies that have a sort of more global reach?
So we are definitely looking at this as a global investment sector. By the numbers, the majority of our investments are in the U.S. That's simply because the U.S. is a little further ahead than the rest of the world in a lot of these things. But we're seeing the rest of the world catch up very, very quickly. We have investments in the UK, in Luxembourg, Argentina. We're looking at companies in Asia, Africa, Australia. And so we're seeing this kind of real global rise of space entrepreneurship because, as you mentioned earlier, this access, right? Now that SpaceX has dropped the cost and increased the frequency and reliability of rides to space, we're seeing middle school students building CubeSats and sending them to space, right? So you have this accessibility that you've never had before that really offers the opportunity to kind of democratize access to space. So, and it's happening all over the globe.
Mm. How I don't know much about this, but what role of can you speak to the role of government regulations and policies in the space industry and how they impact space funds investments?
So that's sticky. Uh, there are a lot of government regulations, um, but in the U.S. specifically, right? That's where we're based, so those are the laws that we're the most familiar with. There's restrictions on foreign investment. If your technology is national security
Hmm.
issue, you can't take investment from foreign investors above a certain percentage of ownership, right? So, and then you've got all of the regulations around the international trafficking of arms.
Hmm.
So things that go boom typically get across the ocean on things that look very much like a rocket. And so you've got this kind of crossover between defense and commercial industry that makes things a little sticky sometimes. And then when we're working with international companies, they have their own set of regulations and their own set of issues in each country. And so it is fairly difficult to navigate. We do talk to lawyers a lot, maybe more so than most venture capitalists. And it's not just about getting your investment paperwork together. We're talking about things like ITAR and CFIUS and all of these kind of acronyms
Yeah.
for the legal issues. But we are starting to see the regulators, everybody from the FAA to commercial or to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, are starting to realize that they need to change their regulations to be more business friendly because of the innovation that's happening. Now, obviously, like with all things legal, I think in all countries, not just in the United States, the laws are always a few years behind the reality of the business, right? It always takes some time to catch up. But I am starting to see some positive forward progress in that realm.
Good. And I like how your sort of modus operandi is very sort of clear on your website where you say like we don't invest in weapons, so you're kind of making it very clear that, you invest in companies that, have a positive future in space, I would say, which is great. Can you discuss any current or, well, future partnerships I was going to talk about? So do you have any, I'm not asking you to sort of name who they are, but are there companies that you sort of got your eye on at the moment that you would, you're considering or sort of ones to watch? I know you guys were at the IAC last year, as was I, and that's probably a good time to see what's going on in the industry and who might be worth investing in. But do you have anyone at the moment that you're looking at?
So can't say any names, obviously when they're in the due diligence pipeline. But yeah, there's always companies in that pipeline. We've got four under consideration right now that we're in various stages of discussions and due diligence with. And so we're always looking for that. Now, this is something I like to say is it's a little lumpy, right? It's not a straight curve of we're going to make, one investment a quarter. It's like we might make three investments in one quarter and then not invest in anybody for 3 quarters, right? Because just the way that these things come to us and the timing of how it works out tends to be a little lumpy. So we haven't made any announcements recently about companies we've invested in because we've had our heads down investigating who those companies are going to be that we're going to make our next investments in.
Fantastic. I gave some tough questions there, so appreciate the answers. Just before you go, tell me something about you personally. What do you do outside of work? Do you have any unusual hobbies or interests that aren't space or business related? And by the way, I don't. Like space and business is all I do, so don't worry if you don't. But
Yeah, that's a great question. I love to spend time on the beach. That's kind of my thing when I'm not working. As an entrepreneur, I'm sure you know this, the work tends to encompass your entire life. You tend to be working all the time, constantly on the phone, constantly, you know what I mean, solving problems and finding the next opportunities. But when I do turn off, I love to spend time on the beach. Specifically, one of my favorite beaches in the world is South Padre Island. As a native Texan, I love South Padre. I love the view of Starship from the beach. Also a big fan of Cocoa Beach, where you can see Kennedy Space Center and the launches from there. So yeah, if I can be somewhere where there's a rocket and a beach, I'm a very happy woman.
You're living the dream. Meagan, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.